Welcome, friends. I want to share with you how the teachings that Blavatsky gave in the 1880s were really setting the foundation for what we know today as quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, the idea is that the atoms and especially the subatomic particles don't follow the same rules or laws that the macrocosmic aspect of life follows. By macrocosmic, I'm referring from the scientific point of view, the things that we can perceive with our senses and bigger than that. So there are laws that apply to the very small, which are different to the laws that apply to the rest of manifestation, let's say. And Blavatsky said this. She wrote, the atoms, being psycho-spiritual, not physical units, act under laws of their own. Now, when she used the word atom, we need to understand the context, because sometimes she was using this word in the way that scientists did for what we all understand as atoms. But since the word atom means non-divisible, and Blavatsky, as we are going to see, postulated that the atom was divisible, sometimes she refused to call that particle atom. And she said there are true indivisible particles on the physical plane, and those are the true atoms. And when we get there, these particles cannot be said to be material any longer. This, as we are going to see, is quite in line with what quantum physics is discovering. So this theory of quantum mechanics has some postulates or some features. I'm going to take some of them, which are the ones about which Blavatsky spoke decades before quantum physics began to develop. So basically, it's a fundamental theory in physics that provides a description of the physical properties of nature at the scale of atoms and subatomic particles. So at the very small scale, as I said. Now, when Blavatsky was writing in the 1880s, the concept, the scientific concept of the atom is that it was like an extremely small particle which could not be subdivided or created or destroyed because it didn't have any parts. And this is why this was called atom, which is indivisible. And then the atoms were thought to be the atoms that belong to one particular element, were supposed to be identical in size, mass, etc. This came from a model proposed by a scientist, Dalton, in 1807. And in the 1880s, when Blavatsky was writing about this, this was the accepted view. In 1888, in her book, The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky challenged this idea of the physical atom being indivisible. She said the atom is divisible, the atom of science, and must consist of particles or subatoms. We today call them subatomic particles. And then she moved on and said, and these subatoms, they too are subject to divisibility, and thus ad infinitum. So she's postulating here that that solid atom that science thought existed is actually composed of subatomic particles. And those subatomic particles are also composed of even more fundamental particles. And she said, you can keep going in this way. In the theosophical view, once you get to the ultimate physical particle, which cannot be subdivided any longer without moving on to the next plane, because if you get the ultimate subatomic particle and you divide it, then you have astral matter. So we can say that within the physical plane, there is an ultimate particle, but even that particle can be divided, and then it resolves itself in another kind of matter. So later, about 10 years after Blavatsky published this idea, J.J. Thomson discovered that there were actually some particles associated to the atom. He discovered what later would be called the electron. But his model of the electron and the atom with the electrons was not the same that we have today. He had this that is sometimes called a plum pudding model, where the electrons were embedded in this sphere, this little ball, the ball being positive and the electrons being negative. It took science several decades to discover that the atom was further divisible. In 1920, the proton was discovered. Then in 1932, the neutron. And eventually, in 1964, the quarks were discovered. The quarks are subatomic particles that compose the neutron and the proton. So this was another level of divisibility that science discovered many years later, about 80 years after Blavatsky wrote about this in The Secret Doctrine. So one of the features of quantum mechanics is that it describes how the energy present in these subatomic particles moves or interacts. Now, remember that when Blavatsky was writing about this, the atom was thought to be just a solid, indivisible little ball that didn't have any internal structure, didn't have any internal energy and internal movement. But Blavatsky challenged that idea, and she said occultism says that in all cases, when matter appears inert, it is the most active. A wooden or a stone block is motionless and impenetrable to all intents and purposes, but its particles are in ceaseless eternal vibration, which is so rapid that to the physical eye, the body seems absolutely devoid of motion. But to physical science, this will be an absurdity. So Blavatsky was aware that the science of the time could not accept this view. The scientific view was very different. But today we know that Blavatsky was right and the scientists were wrong, that there is this ceaseless motion and vibration even in the most solid of objects, like a diamond, for example. So the idea of motion within the atom came in 1902, after Rutherford discovered that every atom contains a small nucleus and that the electrons are moving around that nucleus. Remember that the plum pudding model was with the electrons embedded in that sphere. So now Rutherford discovered that the electrons with the negative charge were separated from a nucleus which had positive charges, and they were moving around. It took a while to discover that the electrons were moving in kind of orbits around the atom, and then later on was even refined. That idea was refined, and now the electrons are thought to be distributed in orbitals, as they are called. But in any case, the idea of movement within the atom came about 14, 15 years after Blavatsky wrote about this. And she said that this energy that is moving the atoms is actually a universal principle. She said, now the occultist who trace every atom in the universe, whether an aggregate of atoms or a single unit, it traces all these atoms to one unit or universal life. The occultists postulate that there is a universal vital principle independent of our matter, which that universal vital principle manifests as atomic energy only on our plane of consciousness. So the energy that we see in the atom, that is how this universal vital principle manifests on the physical plane. Now, she uses the word atomic energy decades before this became a scientific term. Actually, it was only in the 1930s that Fermi developed the notion of atomic energy, or more specifically, the nuclear power that is in an atom when we split the atom, for example. So Blavatsky was talking about this atomic energy about 40 to 50 years before science discovered this. Now, quantum mechanics also establishes that the fundamental forces of nature, which science says there are 4 fundamental forces of nature, they are the result of the exchange of force carrier particles. These are the bosons. These particles move between atoms, let's say, or between objects, or whatever the case is. And in that motion, they transfer energy. And that's what we call a force. So each of the forces of nature is supposed to have, to be actually carried, manifested, expressed by a particular, a specific particle. So this is what quantum mechanics postulates. And again, Blavatsky in 1888, in The Secret Doctrine, she was already saying this, and she was trying to convince scientists that there were foundations to say this. And she was saying, it is not in the least unscientific to speak of the substantiality of the so-called forces. She says, subject to some future specific name, bosons, for example, this force is substance of some kind and can be nothing else. So even though we can say that Blavatsky was presenting a spiritual philosophy, in the theosophical view, substance or matter and spirit or consciousness, they are 2 inseparable aspects of manifestation. So the forces are material, and matter has energy, and both matter and energy are expressions of consciousness in the theosophical view. This is why when Blavatsky describes the ultimate atoms in the physical plane, on the physical plane, she says that they are psycho-spiritual particles, because there is a form of consciousness there, which is being suspected by at least some scientists that work with quantum physics. So she was saying here, this is a fundamental principle in quantum mechanics, that the forces are actually particles moving. Now, she didn't have a naive view of what this substance was. She wasn't talking about substance as scientists knew it. And she made clear when she said the occult sciences do not regard either electricity or any of the forces supposed to be generated by it as matter in any of the states known to physical science at the time. To put it more clearly, none of these forces, so-called, are either solids, gases, or fluids. So again, she's talking about a level of matter, the subatomic level of matter, which we can say is beyond the 3 known states of matter: solid, liquid, gas, and gaseous. And this is actually called today, there is a 4th form or state of matter, which is plasma, which is where we have ions. That means we have atoms that are separated in their positive and negative charges. And this is closer to what Blavatsky is saying here. Of course, with quantum physics, we, as I mentioned, we have given these names of bosons, etc., to this kind of matter, which doesn't belong to the states of matter known by science at the time. Now, another important aspect of this is what the field theory of quantum mechanics postulate, which this was presented or developed in the second half of the 20th century, many decades after The Secret Doctrine was written. The field theory says that quantum particles are not like tiny balls with an inherent size and volume. They are better described as energy fields. So even though we are still in quantum physics, we still use the word particle, subatomic particle. When scientists say that, they don't mean a little ball. They mean, especially in the field theory, they mean an energy field. It's a form of energy. It's not a solid something. And this, again, was written by Blavatsky in The Secret Doctrine. She said that she was saying, we read the first part of this quote earlier, the atom is divisible in subatoms or subatomic particles, which are again divisible, And she says, infinite divisibility of atoms resolves matter into simple centers of force. That is, precludes the possibility of conceiving matter as an objective substance. This is a very quantic way of looking at matter. In quantum physics, when we get closer to the fundamental components of matter, we don't have matter any longer. Mass is an effect produced by this field, the Higgs fields, for example. Shape doesn't have any meaning there. Even position in space it's not really, cannot really be pointed until we freeze that particular energy in a particular way by means of our measurement. Otherwise, we have an energy field. This is exactly what Blavatsky is saying here in The Secret Doctrine. And the last interesting point is that Blavatsky questioned that gravity was a force. She, of course, accepted that there was a phenomenon called gravitation, but she said this is not due to a force. This is not a force in nature. Now, this is different. Even today, scientists are trying to deal and solve this problem, because they say that there are four fundamental forces in nature. The strong force that keeps the nucleus of the atoms together, the weak force, which accounts for the phenomenon of radioactivity, the electromagnetic force, that we know everything that has to do with electricity, magnetism. And then the fourth one is the gravitational force. Now, the standard model of quantum physics can explain three of these four forces. It can explain the electromagnetic, the strong, and the weak forces. They have found the particles that carry these forces, but they have not been able to find a particle that carries the force of gravity. They postulate there must be a particle called graviton, and therefore gravity does not really fit in quantum physics. Many scientists expect that it will fit, that eventually we will find the graviton. But what Blavatsky postulates is that gravity is not really a force. And she wrote quite a bit about this. I'll just bring one quote where she says, however, this is still part of the point of view of science. The most familiar force in our everyday lives, gravity is not part of the standard model, as fitting gravity comfortably in the standard model has proved to be a difficult challenge. So now to Blavatsky's quote, she said that she was talking about magnetism as a force, and she said that such magnetism exists in nature is as certain as that gravitation does not at any rate in the way in which it is taught by science. So she foresaw, in a sense, the problem that physicists find today, the inability to bring together gravity and the theory of relativity that explains what, or that is a theory of gravity, basically, with the quantum physics model. This can be solved if we can explain gravity in terms of the other forces of nature. And there are some scientists working in that direction, instead of postulating that gravity itself is a force that we cannot really find, or we cannot find from a quantic point of view, the particle that expresses gravity. So we can see how Blavatsky has said very specific things about the nature of the atoms and the world of subatomic particles. These are not general statements that there is a probability that they could be right. These are very specific, and it's not only one or two or three. Blavatsky is talking about many of the foundations on which quantum physics stands. So I think this is interesting to take seriously what Blavatsky says about the atoms, because there is a whole other aspect of how Blavatsky explains the atoms as these units of a form of very elemental consciousness, which science has not really probed into, has not really researched. And I think that since Blavatsky was right about this description of what atoms and subatomic particles were, it is worth paying attention to what she said in that other field of the ultimate subatomic particles and the expression of consciousness in the universe.